Great, so hi there everyone, and thanks for joining us for the second in the SOCITS Webinar series. Today we're going to discuss the use of qualitative remote walking interviews with young people and how they can be applied in schools or other settings of interest. My name is Claire Goodfellow. I'm currently an Honorary Research Fellow within the School of Health and Wellbeing at the University of Glasgow. I was previously, until quite recently, the research manager on the SOCITS project, and I was particularly involved in this component of the study, which was the qualitative interviewing, as well as other youth-led components of the study. So before I jump into discussing the interview methodologies, I just wanted to quickly introduce the SOCITS research team. So for those of you who were at the webinar last week, we will have had the chance to meet Mark and Larry, and I think Karina presented to you via video as I'm doing today. We do also have Chris and Julie on the top right, who are our colleagues from the Mental Health Foundation, and the rest of the research team are in the bottom row. So we are quite a broad mix in terms of background and expertise. So we have sociologists, computational modelers, social network analysts, as well as psychologists. And that feeds into the development of the different methods that you can use if you're adopting a SOCITS approach. So again, for those of you who might not have been at the first webinar or potentially haven't heard too much about the SOCITS project, what is SOCITS? What does it even stand for? So SOCITS is short for the Social Situational Systems Approach to Measuring and Modelling Influences on Adolescent Mental Health. So I'm sure as many of you will be aware, there is a growing prevalence of poor mental health amongst young people in particular, and we do know that 50% of all mental health problems arise before the age of 14. Some of you may have even seen the recent Scottish census data, which shows a huge, quite alarming increase in terms of the rates of poor mental health amongst young people. So I think around 2011, it was about 2 or 3% of young people that were reporting poor mental health in the census. And by 2022, that had risen to 15.5%, 15.4, I believe, with poor mental health being particularly high amongst young women. And we do also know from other research that the increase in poor mental health is particularly steep in Scotland compared to other comparable countries as well. So given that context, we've adopted a SOCITS approach, in part because we as a research team believe that classic methods of measuring mental health tend to be individual-centred and decontextualised. They potentially don't fully capture the complexity of adolescents' social and emotional contexts. So as I say, we believe that there's a need for approaches that go beyond this person-centred understanding and to develop methods that take into account the systems and situational understanding and social environmental influences. For this kind of first stage in the SOCITS approach, for doing qualitative walking interviews, our main research question was kind of what situations throughout the school day are associated with stress, loneliness, and mental health stigma. However, it is possible to apply SOCITS approach to many different kind of social constructs or health-related issues. So you can study potentially body image, antisocial behaviour such as bullying, or pro-social behaviour as well. So specifically where the activities and interactions of social interactions are more spatially situated, the SOCITS approach would be particularly relevant for exploring those issues in schools. So as I say, most measures are unsituated. So what do we mean by that? So typically when measuring stress or loneliness or other constructs related to mental health, you tend to ask people how often in the last 7 days or so have you felt low or depressed or other kind of questions around that. And while that is helpful in giving an average of someone's traits in terms of loneliness or depression or so on, it doesn't really capture specific things throughout the school day or within their environment that might be negatively or positively impacting on their mental health. So we know that psychometric work on personality can find that traits such as loneliness or stress can take on different levels within individuals, and they can also vary across different situations. So assessing a fixed level of a trait through traditional methods doesn't necessarily capture that variability. And additionally, individuals can vary their response to the same situation. So for example, depending on who else might be there, as well as other factors, can influence behaviour. So we hope that SOCITS will provide a framework for measuring and understanding and predicting stress, loneliness, and stigma in the actual situations where young people experience them. And so the first step in developing this framework is to identify those relevant situations potentially in the school day where adolescents are experiencing these influences on their mental health. And because these situations might vary widely across different adolescent populations, we're aiming to develop methods that will identify situations that are relevant for each particular school or population. So as I said, in principle, the methods that we use can be extended to any setting, situation or construct. This rather complex looking diagram is kind of the SOCITS project in a slide. So you can see here that work package 1, which is the qualitative walking interviews, does then go to feed on to sort of work package 2, 3 and 4, which is our participatory systems workshops, our surveys and our agent-based modelling, and in fact even this webinar series, which is part of exporting the SOCITS approach to people who would be able to best use it. So today we were going to be talking about work package 1. This is a much more simplified, I hope, diagram which just shows you kind of our suite of methods that you can use if you're adopting a SOCITS study of your own. So there are 4 key methodologies that can be used. So the walking interviews, which we'll discuss today, can then kind of be used to inform workshops within schools with both pupils, teachers, and potentially educational psychologists or anyone else with an interest in kind of youth mental health. Both the walking interviews and workshops can then inform what specific questions you want to ask in your survey to get a more broad view of what's going on within schools. And then also one of the methods that we'll use that will be discussed in a future webinar is agent-based modelling, where you can essentially create an online or a model of a school where you can change certain parameters in terms of stress or loneliness and see how behaviour or stress and loneliness might then change within the school if you implement certain changes. I will put up a slide at the end for anyone who's interested in signing on to more webinars to learn more about those methods. But as I say, today we're just going to be focusing on the first, which was the walking interviews. So the aim of this first work package in the SOCITS study was to identify relevant social situations. So if we want to understand how situations, either physical or social, within the school can impact on health, we first actually need to identify those situations in the individual schools which might be having an influence on well-being, and particularly in our case on loneliness, stress and stigma. So really what we hope to do with these walking interviews is identify hotspots within the school for protecting or worsening kind of mental health amongst the students. In terms of walking interviews, why are they a particularly useful method to use? It is worth noting that walking interviews as a methodology have existed for quite some time. Traditionally, those would be a researcher walking outside with a participant, usually around their local neighbourhood or a place that has meaning or significance for them. The idea being that being in that setting kind of serves as a really strong prompt, I guess, for responses to questions. So it might be that if you're doing a sit-down interview in a room, you might kind of forget about how certain parts of the school might make you feel and so on. So doing the walking interview does provide that contextual insight. And so what do I mean by that? So I guess contextual insight walking interviews allow researchers to gain a deeper understanding of how people interact in their environments and can help capture the relationships between people and the spaces that they inhabit. So from doing remote walk interviews, you do gain this really rich contextual data and you do get increased engagement. So it's, if you can compare a research interview done, as I say, in kind of a room with a one-to-one interview, you do tend to get richer data if you're actually out in the environment in which you're particularly interested in. So as I say, that has existed for quite some time. So what is new or innovative about the SOCITS approach? Well, what we find to be new is that we have done remote walking interviews, which have been done over Microsoft Teams. So why did we choose to do it that way? We chose to do it that way because we, from the start of the SOCITS project, have wanted to have a youth-led approach. And so what that means is that while we were designing the SOCITS study before we'd even submitted to funders, we ran some of our ideas past a small youth advisory group. And we knew that we wanted to do walking interviews with young people, and we said to them, if we as researchers came into your schools to conduct walking interviews, how would you feel about that? And I think the general response was, no, thank you. We don't want to have researchers walking around school with us. That feels quite confronting. And it was young people themselves that suggested that actually we do these interviews online, because it does feel a little bit less confronting potentially. And we also asked, and we were interested to know if they would feel more comfortable with the research team doing these interviews, or if they would feel more comfortable potentially with peer researchers around about their own age doing the walking interviews. And I think the feedback again was overwhelmingly yes, we would like people our own age to conduct the interviews. And so, as I'll go on to discuss, we did recruit some youth advisors and some youth researchers to conduct the qualitative remote interviews. Why is that of benefit from a research perspective? It means that we are more likely to get kind of unbiased responses. So if you have a teacher or a researcher going around with young people, it might be that they might not tell you the whole truth about certain areas. They might not tell you that people tend to vape in the toilets or so on. So we hope that by using a pure research approach that we would get richer data, more true to experience kind of data as well. And it would provide insights into experiences that might be less obvious than in sit-down interviews with a member of the research team. And so one of our methodological aims from doing it this way was that we wanted to develop a framework for analysing not just verbatim transcripts, but also looking at developing a framework for analysing video recordings and drawing on thematic analysis of kind of still frames from the videos, or observation schedules or video segments from each interview. Again, why is doing it remotely innovative and why is that beneficial? So remote walking interviews are a form of visual methodology known as photo elicitation, which typically uses photographs or other visual mediums, such as videos, and they're used in an interview to generate verbal discussion to create data and knowledge. So really, photo elicitation interviews can add texture to discussion by providing that visual dimension that the interviewer can use to probe the participant for additional insights about aspects of the environment and how it might shape their experiences, such as what happens in this place or situation and how does it make you feel. And again, they're sort of an extension of traditional methods, and we hope one that's particularly useful for anyone else wishing to adopt a SOCITS approach in their work. In terms of youth investigators, we kind of place the youth at the centre of our research, and we don't want to do it in a tokenistic way. We want to do it in a meaningful way. And I think that we as researchers are aware that youth involvement can be quite tangential. It tends to be when you're forming your research questions or when you're forming your research plan, and then youth involvement kind of drops off. We want to have youth advisors who could inform us through every stage of the research process, that could participate in collecting data, analysing and giving feedback on results and so on. So we took a step beyond the traditional youth advisory group approach where you have a series of young people who just simply advise, and we expanded on it by having youth advisor investigators, or YAs as we call them. And so, as I was kind of mentioning in the previous slides, the YAs kind of enhance relatability and are beneficial in terms of collecting that qualitative data because they have a shared language and culture between the interviewer and the school age participant. And it does kind of minimise that power imbalance that tends to arise if you have academic researchers or teachers or other kind of adults who are seen to be in a position of power. It really minimises that imbalance. And it was also felt that having youth advisor investigators doing the interviews could enhance like the rapport and relatability, leading to greater openness and discussion of potentially difficult topics that, as I said, might not be so easily shared with adult researchers. And hopefully, yeah, it fostered a shared sense of understanding and empathy that provided us with richer data that we might not have gained otherwise. And so, as I mentioned, we have colleagues on the Mental Health Foundation who've been really integral in helping us in terms of our youth participation. So they helped us recruit initially 5 youth advisor investigators who were all aged between 15 and 20. So they were either currently in secondary school or hadn't long left secondary school. And they helped us conduct 13 remote interviews across 2 different schools in Scotland. And they did receive training and support from the research team. I should also say that for safeguarding and ethical issues, there was always a member of the research team in the room while these interviews were being conducted, just in case any of the participants should disclose anything that needed follow up. Youth advisor investigators were also involved beyond the qualitative interviewing, and as I say, were involved throughout the entirety of the SOCITS research project. So they've been involved in workshops, they've given loads of feedback on our agent-based model and our survey development, and have had other opportunities throughout, including giving presentations at workshops in London and other kind of ad hoc opportunities, because we really want to make sure that our youth advisors are being rewarded and given opportunities to participate wherever we can do so. So in terms of what did the qualitative walking interviews look like, I'm just providing kind of a screenshot of what our interview schedule looked like. And again, I think the research team, we came up with questions that we were interested in and that we'd like to ask, although the youth advisors, investigators developed the script based on that initial schedule, in part to make it more user-friendly, so you can see that they've added different colours and spaced it out and formatted it quite nicely for reading whilst you're conducting the interview. They also gave us feedback that was really invaluable. So I think we had often asked about stress or loneliness, and they had suggested potentially reframing in a more positive way. So instead of asking about loneliness, why don't we ask about social connection? Instead of stress, asking about spaces where young people might potentially feel calm in school. And another piece of invaluable feedback from the youth advisor investigators was when we were asking questions about stigma. We might need to be a little bit more careful around that language. It's not particularly a language that young people themselves would use, and so they've suggested a little definition of stigma there as well. So again, it was a nice example of co-production because they put it together in a framework that worked for them. And so I should say that the interview process included a consent process where we just double checked that the participants were still willing to participate before we began recording. And the interview itself started with what we called the standing portion of the interview, where we'd ask the interviewer just to stay where they were and tell us about specific parts of the school that were of importance to them or that influenced their health and well-being or that had a particularly strong emotional valence for them. And we would then ask them to walk around the school, showing us those places as well as other places. And while they were passing through these spaces, we would then sort of ask, how do these spaces make you feel? What typically happens here? Is this a space where you might feel lonely? Is this a space where you might feel connected? And so on. And that allowed us to gather really helpful data around what these spaces looked like, as well as the kind of interactions that happened within those spaces at different times of day with different social groups and how that might impact on well-being. Just some practical tips from learning from a few of the complications that you might have had. So always ensure that you have good Wi-Fi connection or signal, particularly so if you're working in rural schools. We did have a few interviews where the signal dropped completely. In some cases, the head teacher was giving out their own personal iPhone so that they could record their interviews over Teams, which is not ideal. So do ensure that you either have good Wi-Fi connection or signal, or you can provide some sort of signal boost of some sort. One thing as well was, if you're conducting walk interviews, is to constantly remind the participant that the camera needs to be facing out, which tends to make them more comfortable because the focus is not then on their face, it's more on the space that they're in. One thing though is that with the poor signal, you do need to move the camera quite slowly or you get quite blurred or pixelated images. We had the capacity to provide devices, so we did send out through the mail, we sent iPads and mobile devices which we could use, and that from our point of view was to do with ethical considerations around making sure that people weren't excluded due to not having access to devices. In terms of ethics as well, we had to make sure that interviews were done after school hours, and that was in part because we were interviewing specific young people who had consented to be part of that interview process, and if we were to do it at a busy time of day, they might be capturing other young people moving around the school that hadn't necessarily consented to being in that video interview. And so we had to do our interviews after school, which also came with the additional ethics around making sure that young people could get home okay and that there were enough staff in the school to make sure that things were safe. So we did always make sure there was a contact teacher that was there for the end of the interview, and we always made sure that that people could get home safely, and if we had to arrange taxis, we could do that too. Um, in terms of some of the findings from the qualitative interviews, we can show you a few stills from the interviews that we did. So you can see here is an art department from school 2, and then posters outside the music room in school 2 as well. And why we've particularly highlighted these images is that these were spaces that young people fed back that they enjoyed or they found interesting, and I think in part because of the bright colours and decorations. And so posters and different decorations throughout the school were kind of seen as being a very positive thing. They improved mood, and I think made the school feel a bit more homely. The library was also a really popular area in both schools that we worked in. So it was seen as being a particularly social area with contextual features such as board games, which facilitated positive interactions and the fostering of friendships. So libraries were viewed very positively. Corridors could be a little bit of a mixed bag. We've got, one particularly dark corridor here, as well as one kind of plain corridor, but it was felt that often corridors were a source of stress. They were particularly busy, prone to pushing and shoving, and sometimes a little bit depressing if they were dark and not very well lit, or if they weren't particularly well decorated. If they were quite bland or empty like these, they were seen as being a bit of a negative space. And we've just pulled out a few quotes from some of the interviews which reflect some of that. So you can see here in the yellow, it's just so bright and colourful, and I love just being in this class. It was amazing. And so the bright, colourful aspect of some classrooms and the decoration was taken very, very positively. Again, on the top here, I feel stressed in the hall because I feel like I'm going to get shoved over. I feel like I'm going to lose my foot or my footing. So I think corridors were particularly relevant source of stress. And I'll let you read through some of the quotes there. I won't read through them all. But moving on to sort of, the overall aim of this work package was to identify those common situations that might be influencing mental health. And so ones that came through very often was, congested corridors, being in the library, doing PE as well as using the PE changing room. And so those were seen slightly differently. I think doing PE could often be seen more in a positive way. Using the PE changing rooms was quite a big source of stress in both schools. Eating lunch in the school canteen came up very often, and occasionally we discussed kind of negative interactions with staff around uniform. And so we're looking at the social aspects as well. So what were common peer interactions in those spaces? So some of the positive ones were eating lunch together with your friends or playing board games and talking. And negative interactions, as you might expect, were things like bullying or gossiping. Vaping came up a lot, as well as that kind of pushing and shoving component in the corridors. Um, I've got a brief summary of our findings here. So what we did find was that pupils tend to have quite strong feelings around most of the places and situations in schools, and actually there was hardly any that were referred to in kind of neutral terms. So most places in school do have meaning of some sort to young people. And as I say, busy areas such as corridors and stairwells were kind of hotspots for stress, and do have a tendency to evoke those negative interactions such as pushing and shoving. At both schools we worked in, we found that the students tended to be segregated by year, and so there was areas where some of the more senior students would spend time, and younger students kind of felt nervous about accessing those spaces or going through them. Toilets were often seen as being a negative space because they were often a site of vandalism or gossip or bullying. And the library, as I say, was more seen as a bit of a sanctuary, a bit quieter. We could have interactions with friends and have that kind of quieter study space. In terms of kind of our key constructs of stigma and loneliness, stigma didn't come through too strongly in the interview. I think it's probably quite a difficult construct to measure or to convey. So it didn't come through too strongly. We did get some mention of it in terms of accessing guidance. So guidance could be seen as a bit more of a conspicuous location, and if you're seen to be accessing it, people might think, oh, maybe you've got a mental health problem going on, or they might be seen as a snitch, or they're going to guidance on someone. And also there wasn't necessarily mention of stigma towards poor mental health, but there was mention of stigmas that could potentially impact. So, for example, in one school, one of the pupils indicated that they had seen some boys picking on one of the girls around their race, and so there is some stuff that we picked up around stigma, but not necessarily mental health stigma, as it were. Um, and it should be said as well that stress tended to come up more strongly than loneliness in the interviews. Potentially that's because stress is maybe easier or more socially acceptable for young people to talk about. It's quite common, I think, to be stressed out about exams or schoolwork. Loneliness tends to be a little more stigmatised amongst adolescents, particularly because it's just a stage of life where being social and being with your friends is the social norm, and so loneliness is a little bit more difficult often to talk about with young people, and that might be something that we want to rephrase or think about a little bit more for our next set of interviews. So you've done your interviews. What do you then do with your data? We on the research team have developed what we have now named the SCIRI reporting framework. And so what that stands for is situations, contextual features, interactions, responses, and improvement of situations. And so what I'll do to make that a little bit more meaningful is I'll run through a couple of worked examples. So I should say we took transcripts of all our interviews and analysed them. That's how we came up with this framework, as these were kind of key themes throughout the interviews. So you can see here our reporting framework, which can then be split into kind of positive and negative. And as you can see, a positive situation might be, or how you can look at corridors and hallways and stairwells. So some of the positives are kind of sitting together at lunchtime. So suggested improvements might be additional social areas for people to have lunch to kind of avoid that crowdedness. In general, though, corridors were seen as being particularly negative. So they were narrow, unpatrolled, and they were congested between classes. Quite often there was pushing and shoving, and fights could break out. And one of the responses to that was stress, anxiety, and a general feeling of overwhelm. Suggested improvements was a well-enforced one-way system, or 5-minute early or late passes to kind of reduce that busyness between classes. And it actually was quite interesting to note that through the interviews, a lot of pupils, whether intended or otherwise, did seem to often offer these kind of suggested improvements quite naturally. I'm sure they were built upon, in the following workshops, but they did come through in the interviews as well. So next, looking at the library in terms of positive and negative, this was again, it was mostly seen as being a positive space. So if we look at the library as a situation, the contextual features that were positive included being quiet, peaceful, there was enough seating for everyone. One of the positive interactions, as I'd mentioned, was playing board games or getting help from the librarians or the library staff. Our response to being in that situation was that it often felt relaxing. A suggested improvement was potentially additional seating in other areas where pupils can get to socialise. In terms of negative stuff, in the library situation, some did report that it could get a little bit noisy at times. Some of the interactions were disruptive or loud. And a response to that situation was that you could often feel quite stressed. And a suggested improvement, therefore, was that staff presence might be required to keep the area kind of clean and tidy and a little bit quieter. So I've thrown through a couple of examples there, but essentially what might be the impact or the benefits of doing a qualitative walking interview of your own in your own school? So what we found is that they're really, really helpful in getting really rich, detailed information on mental well-being and different social behaviours that are very specific to your own school. So if you're doing any health and well-being planning, you do get this very tailored information about what works and potentially what doesn't work in your school. And as we saw through the SCIRI framework, that can lead to kind of these no or low cost suggested improvements. So for example, things like 5-minute early or late passes or having more staff in the corridors during between classes may potentially impact on stress and improve it. Other additional benefits of doing walking interviews, and from speaking to our own youth advisor investigators who we trained to do these interviews, they felt that it improved their communication skills and their confidence, and so there is benefit to those conducting interviews as well. So if you're considering maybe having some of your senior students, or if you've got a wellbeing group conducting interviews, it was fed back to us that those did improve those kind of skills as well. I think that is everything I was going to run through today. So yeah, so thank you for listening. That is my email address if anyone has any follow-up questions. As I say, I'm currently I've moved on to a different post, but I do still monitor my email at Glasgow, and I will absolutely keep an eye out for any questions relating to sockets.